9-year-old Clara Calloway was digging through the miller's trash can at 6 o'clock in the morning. Not for food, not for aluminum cans to sell at the depot. She was pulling out a cracked black garden hose, coiling it over her small shoulder like a heavy rope, and walking away without a single word. Mr. Miller watched from his wooden porch in his flannel bathrobe, his coffee mug suspended halfway to his mouth. "You want that old thing," he called out, his voice cutting rough through the morning quiet. "It is split down the middle, useless." "I know," Clara said, and just kept walking. She was not fixing hoses. Anyone could see that. She never brought heavy rolls of adhesive tape, never brought glue, and never patched a single hole. She was not selling the rubber either. She never took the hoses to the recycling center in town, even though it was only a short bike ride down Ridgeview Road. She was not making crafts, no woven baskets, and no strange garden decorations hanging from the porch. By the end of that week, she had 15 broken hoses stacked in a silent coiled mound behind her family's worn barn in rural Georgia. And she would not tell a single soul why. Her older brother Silas, 16, and allergic to anything that was not a straight answer, cornered her by the chicken coop. "Everyone in town thinks you have lost your mind," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Mrs. Pruitt says you are a strange little collector." Clara just shrugged her small shoulders and kept coiling the rubber. By Sunday, half the county had heard about the girl gathering garbage. At the weekly church gathering, 3 women stood near the large metal coffee urn, trying not to laugh and failing. "She has got old man Weber's hose too," one whispered. "The one full of holes he ran over with the tractor." "Bless her heart," said another. "But what in the world is a child going to do with a pile of broken hoses?" Nobody knew. Not the neighbors. Not the farmers who had seen 60 growing seasons between them. Not even her own parents, who exchanged a worried glance every time Clara disappeared behind the barn, with something new draped over her arm. Whatever she was planning, only she knew the shape of it. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. The Calloway farm sat on 60 acres of red Georgia clay, and that summer, the soil was angry. It had not rained in nearly 40 days. The kind of brutal dry that cracks the ground into little puzzle pieces. The kind of dry that makes farmers stand at their fences at dusk, staring at a sky that refuses to cooperate. Clara's father, Jacob Calloway, was a quiet man who had inherited the farm from his own father and carried the weight of it in his shoulders. He did not yell when things went wrong, he just got quieter, and that summer he had gone nearly silent. His peach orchard rows were wilting by 10 o'clock in the morning. His delicate young trees had started curling their leaves inward, a defense mechanism against the heat that meant the plants were rationing what little water they had left, like a body going into shock. The fruit remained small, hard and green, refusing to swell in the baking heat. "We lose the peaches, we lose the co-op contract," Jacob told his wife, Martha, one evening at the kitchen table. 3 years we have built that account, gone in one dry summer. Martha was the practical one. She did not deal in worry, she dealt in solutions, or at least the search for them. "The Millers are running commercial soaker hoses along their rows, cut their water use nearly in half," she said. "Soaker hoses cost money we do not have," Jacob said. "And even if we bought them tomorrow, half our acreage would still be bone dry by the time they arrived." It was Grandpa Earl, Martha's father, who said nothing that night. He had farmed this land through droughts in the 70s that made this one look gentle. He just listened, chewing slowly, his pale blue eyes drifting toward the window, toward the barn, toward wherever his granddaughter had disappeared to. Martha, for her part, had already tried the direct approach. 2 days earlier, she had found Clara hosing dirt off her hands at the outdoor spigot and asked plainly, "What exactly are you doing back there, honey?" "Fixing something," Clara had said. "Fixing what?" "The part nobody has noticed yet," Clara replied. Martha had not pushed further. She recognized the look on her daughter's face, the same stubborn focus Jacob wore when he was working through a problem on the tractor, the kind of look that did not respond well to interruption. She had let it go, filing it away the way a practical woman files away anything she cannot yet explain, patiently and without panic. Because Grandpa Earl had noticed something nobody else had. Clara was not playing behind that barn, she was working. It had all started a full month before that morning, at the Miller's trash can, before the 15 hoses, before the whispers at church, before any of it. It began on an ordinary Tuesday, when Clara had been sent to fetch water for the chickens. She had noticed something strange near the base of the old cedar tree, by the vegetable patch. A tiny crack in the main irrigation line, barely wider than a pencil, had been leaking there for who knew how long. Nobody had bothered fixing it, because it seemed insignificant, but the grass around that one small leak was a different color than everywhere else. Deep green, thick, almost lush in a yard that was otherwise the color of straw. Clara crouched down and stared at it for a long time. Everywhere else water came from the commercial sprinkler in wide, wasteful arcs, spraying into the air, evaporating before it ever reached the roots, running off into the dry cracks in the soil and disappearing. But here, at this one small leak, water dripped slowly, steadily, directly into the ground, and the ground was drinking it, not losing it. She did not say anything to anyone. She just started paying attention. She watched how her mother watered the flower boxes, fast, generous, and gone in seconds, most of it running straight off the surface. She watched how dew collected on spider webs at dawn and slid down, drop by drop, exactly to the base of each plant. Like nature had already figured out the answer, and nobody was watching closely enough to see it. That same week, she found her grandmother's old leather notebook on the highest shelf in the attic. The pages were yellowed and smelled of old paper, filled with handwritten notes on soil and rain. On one page, her grandmother had written a single line that changed everything for Clara. The earth does not need a flood to stay alive. It needs a patient drop that knows exactly where the roots are hiding. Building it was not easy, and it was not pretty. Behind the old Sorn barn, in the deep shade where nobody usually looked, Clara laid the 15 broken hoses end to end across the red clay, studying where each crack, split, and puncture already existed. She realized something important from her library books and her grandmother's notes. She did not need to seal every single hole. She needed some holes, small, controlled ones, spaced out along the length of each hose, so water could drip out slowly along the row of peach trees, instead of gushing out violently from one broken end. She used a sewing needle, held carefully with a pair of pliers and heated over a candle flame until it glowed a dull red, to carefully widen a few of the smaller natural cracks into tiny, even holes. Too big, and the water would rush out in one single spot and leave the rest of the row bone dry. Too small, and nothing would come through the thick rubber at all. She connected the mismatched hoses using scraps of black electrical tape, strips of old bicycle inner tubes she had cut with kitchen shears, and a few brass fittings Grandpa Earl had lying forgotten in his rusted iron toolbox. Things he hadn't touched since before Clara was born. For days, she worked in secret during the late afternoons, running her patchwork lines along the base of the struggling peach rows. She buried them just under a thin layer of dry pine needles and grass clippings she had raked from the yard, because she knew mulch helps hold moisture in, instead of letting it evaporate straight into the hot afternoon air. The town's gossip continued to drift down Ridgeview Road, but Clara treated the whispers like the weather. She observed them, but she never let them change her direction. Then, with her heart pounding against her ribs, she connected the entire patchwork system to the outdoor spigot and turned the heavy iron handle. For one glorious second, nothing happened. Then the entire system burst. Water sprayed sideways out of a poorly sealed joint with a loud pop, drenching Clara from head to toe and turning the dry red dirt around her into an instant mud pit. Two of the middle hoses disconnected entirely under the sudden pressure, thrashing wildly on the ground like startled black snakes. Half the first peach row got flooded in a muddy pool, while the rest of the line stayed bone dry. Her older brother Silas, walking by with a heavy bucket of feed, stopped and stared, then couldn't help himself. "Well, that is one way to take a shower," he laughed. Clara did not laugh. She sat right there in the mud, soaked, staring at her failed invention, feeling something twist hard and cold in her chest. That night at dinner, she did not say a single word. Martha noticed the red mud still crusted behind her daughter's ears. Jacob noticed the defeated slump in her small shoulders. Even Silas, for all his teasing, noticed she barely touched her meatloaf. It was Grandpa Earl who finally spoke, cutting his pork chop without looking up from his plate. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "first system I ever built with my own hands failed worse than that. Flooded my father's whole east field. He did not speak to me for a week." Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "But the second attempt," Grandpa Earl continued, meeting her gaze, "worked well enough to save half our corn that year. And the third attempt is the one that kept this family fed through the worst drought this county has ever seen." Whatever you are building back there, girl, you do not quit after the failures. You quit after you stop trying to fix them. Nobody else at that table asked what she was building, but for the first time, nobody laughed either. The second attempt was better, but it still was not right. Clara fixed the joint that had burst, wrapping it tighter with thicker layers of old inner tube, securing it with wire she had bent by hand with pliers. She spaced the drip holes more evenly this time, testing the water pressure by feel, adjusting where the flow ran too strong or too weak. The system held, and water dripped, slow and steady, exactly like she had seen at that old cedar tree. But three of her connector joints, cobbled together from different hose diameters, still leaked badly at the seams, wasting almost as much water as it saved. She almost gave up that night, sitting behind the barn in the dark, staring at her tangle of patched rubber, wondering if everyone laughing at her had been right all along. Then she remembered the spider web, the way each drop found its way to exactly the right place, one beat at a time, with nothing wasted. She went back to her grandmother's book. She found a small diagram, showing how old hose sections could be joined using short pieces of rigid pipe as internal sleeves, gripped tight by metal hose clamps, instead of tape or wire. She did not have hose clamps, but Grandpa Earl's toolbox, it turned out, had exactly 6 of them, rusted but functional, left over from a tractor repair decades ago. The third attempt took her 4 more days of patient labor. When she turned the spigot handle this time, the water moved through the entire length of hose, in a slow, quiet hiss. No bursts, no flooding, just a steady, patient drip, drop by drop, sinking straight into the soil beneath the mulch, exactly where the roots were waiting. By the middle of August, the heat wave transformed from a seasonal burden into an absolute crisis. A blinding, relentless sun beat down upon Oconee County, and a scorching wind swept across the ridge, drying up the remaining moisture in the air until breathing felt like swallowing dust. The modern commercial orchards along Ridgeview Road, relying on high-pressure metal sprinklers and chemical fertilizers to force growth, began to buckle under the strain. The enormous volumes of water they sprayed into the air vanished instantly, evaporating into the shimmering heat waves, before a single drop could pierce the hard crust of the earth. Their leaves turned to a crisp, brittle brown, and their small, underdeveloped peaches dropped to the ground, ruined and baking in the dirt. But behind the Calloway barn, a quiet miracle was unfolding beneath the layers of pine needles and straw. Clara had turned the spigot handle completely open, and the water moved through the 15 salvaged hoses with a steady, rhythmic hiss. The system did not falter. Drop by drop, hour after hour, the water sank directly into the red clay, bypassing the burning air entirely. The soil beneath the thick mulch remained cool, dark, and damp to the touch. Even during the most punishing hours of the afternoon, while just 3 feet away, the unwatered ground remained cracked and pale as old bone. Over the next 3 weeks, the 2 rows of peach trees connected to Clara's patchwork line began to change in a way that defied the season, while the rest of the Calloway orchard continued to struggle. Their branches thinning and leaves curling inward, Clara's rows deepened from a stressed yellowish hue into a rich, vibrant emerald green. The wooden trunks thickened, drinking deeply from the hidden reservoir beneath the earth. The fruit, which had been small, hard, and stagnant, began to swell rapidly, drawing sweetness from the deep roots and turning a brilliant, sun-kissed crimson. Jacob Calloway walked the rows one evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long purple shadows across the clay. He stopped before one of Clara's trees, reaching out a rough, calloused hand to run his thumb over a thick, moisture-heavy leaf. He crouched down, brushing away the dry mulch, and pressed his palm flat against the earth, feeling the deep, cool dampness radiating from the soil. "Martha," he called out, his quiet voice cracking slightly under the weight of what he was seeing. "Come look at this." His wife walked out from the porch, stopping beside him. For a long, unbroken moment neither of them said a word, staring at the heavy branches bowing under the weight of massive, ripe peaches. Grandpa Earl stood by the barn door, a soft smile creeping across his weathered face, the quiet satisfaction of an old farmer who had seen the truth proven without needing to utter a single word. Word of the green rose traveled swiftly through the small community, carrying the kind of disbelief that only practical people possess. A few curious neighbors drove their trucks slowly past the Calloway property, pointing at the vibrant green stripe, slashing through an otherwise dusty landscape. Mr. Miller shook his head in absolute bewilderment. and Mrs. Pruitt murmured at the market that she had never witnessed such an impossible sight. Yet, most of the county remained guarded, refusing to believe that a collection of discarded junk could truly save an orchard. The real test, they all whispered, would be measured on the scales during harvest day. When that morning finally arrived, a small crowd had gathered along the wooden fence line at the edge of the Calloway property, standing with their arms crossed, silent and waiting. Jacob backed the old flatbed truck up to the first green row, and Silas and Clara began loading the heavy wooden crates side by side. What they pulled from those branches silenced every remaining doubt. Crate after crate was filled with massive deep red peaches, so heavy that the branches had required wooden stakes to keep from snapping. The fruit was flawless, sweet-smelling, and bursting with juice, pulled from a soil that had remained cool and alive throughout the worst drought in 40 years. By the time the sun reached its peak, the bed of the truck was completely full, holding more premium fruit than the co-op contract required, and more than Jacob had harvested in the previous 2 seasons combined. Mr. Miller, the man who had watched Clara dig through his rubbish without a second thought, stood at the edge of the row, with his hands resting heavily on his hips, watching crate after crate of crimson fruit pass him by. He looked down at the old, cracked black hose winding through the dirt, then looked up at the 9-year-old girl. He walked forward slowly, paused by the wooden fence, and quietly pulled off his worn cap. "I stood right there on my porch and called this junk," Miller admitted, his voice rough but clear, refusing to look away from his own mistake. "I was wrong, Clara. Our trees are dying down the road. If you have the time, I will pay you honest wages to show me how to lay these lines across my own orchard." Mrs. Pruitt stood beside him, staring at the loaded flatbed truck in absolute disbelief. "How does something broken end up doing this?" she asked quietly. Clara, her fingers still stained with the dark resin of the peach trees and the red clay of the county, looked at the crowd. "A commercial sprinkler waters the air," she said simply, her voice carrying the steady weight of her grandfather's old wisdom. "This waters the roots. Some of the holes were already there. I made the rest myself and chose exactly where the water needed to go." There was no triumph in her voice, no desire to gloat before the neighbors who had laughed at her. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a child who had looked at the earth and understood its hidden hunger. That evening, after the trucks had departed for the co-op and the dust had finally settled, Clara sat on the top rail of the wooden fence alongside Grandpa Earl. The twilight sky turned a deep, bruised purple over 60 acres of green that had no right to exist in a summer that dry. She opened her grandmother's old leather notebook on her lap, picked up a pencil, and carefully wrote a single new line beneath the old faded ink. "The things the world throws away are never truly finished. They are just waiting for someone patient enough to see what they can become." If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.